Okay, so we know about authentication. We know about authorization. We've covered network authentication protocols like Kerberos and so on. Let's put it all together into one tangible ecosystem, and that would be an identity management environment. So with an identity management system, we have a number of options that are available to make it easier for people to get access to what they need access to. Consider, for example, single sign-on or SSO. I'm sure you've experienced this in just using internet apps out there, where you sign into an app, but it doesn't prompt you for credentials if you've already configured it, for example, to use your Facebook account or your Google account when you sign in. With single sign-on, we have to authenticate at least once initially, but afterwards we don't have to keep entering our username and password, for instance. So protocols like OpenID and OAuth are used to make this type of thing happen. Let's see what that looks like. Here in my web browser, I've gone to the Houzz, HOUZZ.com website for no particular reason. It could be just about any website these days. This one focuses on interior decorating and home improvements and that type of stuff. But what's important here is I can either sign up with a standard email address and create an account, or in this particular website's case, I could choose Continue with Google. Now that's a great option if you already have a Google account. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Now in the authentication dialog box that opens up, I want you to notice that in the URL, it's making a reference to OAuth 2. And we just finished saying that standards like OpenID and OAuth are used out on the internet to allow things like single sign-on. That way you don't have to remember a bunch of different account credentials for a bunch of different sites. OAuth is the Open Authorization Framework. So at any rate, what I can do here is sign in and specify my Google credentials. When I do that, it will allow me to sign in using Google, and if I've already signed into Google, you can bet the next time I go to this site, I'll be signed in automatically. So once you've entered in the username and the password, in this case for an existing Google account, depending on how that's configured, you might be prompted for two-step verification. So I'm going to go ahead and approve that login attempt because my Google account is configured with two-step authentication to send an approval request to my phone. After which, I'm then signed into the site. But I didn't create an account on that site. I'm using an existing one. So very, very convenient. Now that leads us into our next related topic, identity federation. What is that? It's one of those buzz terms that we hear quite a bit. Well, identity federation is pretty much what we've just seen. It means that you've got a bunch of resources, in this case websites, that will trust a single authentication source, in our case, Google. But it might also trust Facebook or Twitter or whatever the case might be. So with identity federation, we have a centralized trusted identity provider, an IDP, that multiple resource providers or RPs, like websites, trust. We saw that protocols like OAuth 2 can be used, but there are other protocols that might be at play as well within identity federation, like SAML, S-A-M-L. That stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, in case you care. But what we really care about is what it does and why it's important. How is it used? So a SAML token is a digital security token that proves your identity. Now you might wonder, well, how does that play out exactly? The best way for us to do that is to look at a diagram. In our diagram, in step 1, we've got a user connecting, let's say, to a web app. So a website. So they're connecting to a resource. Now, the next thing that happens in step number 2 is that resource, that's a resource provider, that resource will then send some kind of a notification back to the user device saying, I don't do authentication. Instead, why don't you go through this central identity provider? Whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, or whether on premises it's just an Active Directory domain controller. You can do that too. Either way, the user in step 2 is redirected to the centralized identity provider, the IDP. After the user successfully authenticates, the identity provider will digitally sign an authentication token. And if it's configured to use SAML, we'll call that a SAML token, but there are different types of configurations. So now that SAML token is sent back to the user device. And the user device then passes off that SAML token, in this case to the web app, to the resource provider. Because the resource provider trusts the identity provider, By extension, it'll trust any digitally signed tokens from it. So the user then just gets access to that app. Now this is all transparent to the user. All the user knows is I connected to the app, I signed in, and then I was in. And if single sign-on is enabled, they might not even have to do the sign-in. Even that might be taken care of automatically for them. So identity federation is possible with products on premises like Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services or other third-party products like Shibboleth, to name just a few. Of course, it's already in use out there on the internet. So identity management systems then bring everything together when it comes to authentication, authorization, network authentication protocols, and centralized identity providers.